Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers of the Congress and of the symposium for the invitation. And thank you very much to you that are here. You're not doing a siesta. Invasive species are a major cause of the biodiversity crisis, and they are causing quite a number, or they are implicated in quite a number of extinctions. And the issues of invasive species is quite important, particularly for fresh waters. As scientists, we can have two different perspectives on invasive species. On the one side, we can say, oh, invasive species are an excellent opportunity to perform interesting studies and to try to address key questions in ecology or in evolution. So ecologists are using invasive species to understand how, for example, ranges shift in time, how adding a new species to an ecological network can modify the properties if you add a predator, a competitor, a browser. Invasive species are also used to understand how species adapt when they are in a new environment. So, and there are many more questions that can be addressed using invasive species. But if you look at the same species from the conservation point of view, we have exactly the opposite position, because for the conservation point of view, invasive species are just a problem, a very big problem, and a problem that has that makes challenges for management, for monitoring. It makes difficult the connection with the environmental policies, and there are really many issues that arise when we try to tackle invasive species from the conservation point of view. So what I would like to show here is to try to reconcile the two approaches, and so use an interesting system of invasions in fresh waters to, on the one side, explore some ecological questions, but also to try to provide some indication that is useful for policy and for management from some point of view. So I'm speaking about the North American red swamp crayfish, and yesterday Ivan showed a very nice presentation why the species is a problem. It's a North American species that is invasive in many continents, and in Europe it's invasive in more or less all the Mediterranean and Western countries. And so the first question I will try to address is how is the impact of these invasive species on the food web? Invasive species often cause very complex and indirect impacts, but usually when we address the impact of invasive species, we took the most direct approach, and we just give a look to the direct impact. So we introduce a predator, so we can assume that this is a direct impact on prey. But actually, invasive species can have very complex indirect impacts that can be as important as the direct impacts. So invasive species can modify the habitats, can modify the relationships between native species and their habitat, and they can have a pretty complex impact when added to a food web. And the complex impacts for the moment remain less studied and less understood than the direct impacts of invasive species, but actually the indirect impacts may be at least as important as the direct impacts. So the American crayfish is an interesting species because it is a species that feeds on multiple components of food webs. So if it's on plants, but it also feeds on insects, and from this system is also interesting to note that it also feeds on vertebrates that are present in fresh water, like we will see the larvae of amphibians. In my first part of the talk, I will try to address the mesopredator release hypothesis with this invasive species. The mesopredator release hypothesis is about a system in which we have predators that stay at an intermediate level of the food web. So in this case, for example, a dragonfly larva is a mesopredator that feeds on the prey in this case is the tadpole. So the mesopredator preys on tadpoles, and so is expected to reduce the abundance of its prey. So but if to this system we add a top predator, the top predator will feed on the mesopredator. And so the mesopredator release hypothesis states that the reduction of mesopredators will reduce the pressure over the prey, and so the prey may actually take advantage of adding a top predator to a system. So we have a system in which we have the top predator, that is the American crayfish, the mesopredator, that are the large invertebrates like dragonfly larvae, beetle larvae, and amphibians that are the lower level of the food chain. And so we can predict that amphibians are, first of all, affected by the environmental conditions of wetlands where they live. The predators, the insects, affect and reduce the density of amphibian larvae, but if the crayfish reduces the abundance of mesopredators, we can also expect that amphibian larvae can take advantage by the limitation of native predators. So we tried to address this question in a system in northern Italy in which the crayfish was introduced very few years ago, 3 or 4 years before the start of this study. And we considered a number of wetlands spread over the landscape, of which half were invaded by the crayfish and half were free. And we used pipe sampling to try to sample the whole freshwater community. So this pipe seals a segment of the wetland, so it's possible to remove and count and all the animals that are present, so all the tadpoles, all the insects, and of course also the crayfish. And then we analyzed the relationships between the communities of amphibians, insects, and the crayfish, of course. Well, this just to show, of course, we have wetlands with a number of species of amphibian species. We found a number of taxa of aquatic predators. Here we considered dragonfly larvae, the larvae of deteched beetles, and notonecta. And of course, we have quite a variation in the abundance of the crayfish, with up to 23 individuals per square meters. So what we have found? First of all, yes, we found a negative relationship between the abundance of predators and the amphibian larvae. So actually, the larvae of newts were negatively related to the tischids and to notonecta, while the tadpoles, the larvae of frogs and toads, were negatively related to mostly to dragonflies. Yes, there was a clear and strong relationship between the abundance of crayfish and the distribution of insects. But we also got some really unexpected result. First of all, we did not find any significant relationship between the environmental features of the pond, like vegetation or abiotic features, like hydroperiod, pond sites, and the abundance of larvae. Apparently, the distribution of amphibian larvae was not related to the features of wetlands, and this was really unexpected because in the same area with the same species, previous studies clearly showed a strong relationship between amphibian communities and pond features. And we found a clear negative relationship between the crayfish abundance and the abundance of larvae. And the negative relationships was the same if we take or if you don't take into account the effect of insects. So, and the relationship was negative, was clear. With the high abundance of crayfish, we never got amphibian larvae, or we just had very, very few of them. So this is more or less the summary of the relationship between the different taxa. So negative effect of the crayfish, negative effect of the insects on amphibians, and no effect of pond features on amphibian communities. So our predictions were that the insects reduce the abundance of amphibians, and this was confirmed. The second prediction was that the crayfish reduces the predators, and this was confirmed, but we also got some unexpected results. And first of all, apparently amphibian communities were not related to the features of wetlands, and amphibians did not take any advantage of the reduction of their native predators. So how can we explain those patterns? How is it possible that wetland features don't affect anymore the amphibian communities? Apparently, the single factor that at this moment influences the communities of amphibians was just the presence-absence of the crayfish, and not anymore the habitat. This is quite alarming because, of course, the adults identify the right breeding site because different environmental features have important fitness consequences on amphibian larvae. So if this relationship doesn't hold anymore, this is quite a problem. And amphibians didn't benefit at all from the limited abundance of predators. This means that the predatory impact of one single invasive species, just the crayfish alone, has a stronger impact than the whole community of native predators that are present in the wetlands. So one single invasive species has a much stronger predation pressure than the whole community of native predators. It's quite alarming. Okay, so we also try to figure out how we can translate our results in management indications. We know well that the abundance of invasive species grow with time. So early after the introduction, species that will become invasive are not abundant, so they are starting to grow, and so they actually don't cause a strong impact. But with time, the abundance of species that get invasive increases, the impact increases. The problem is that if the species is abundant, is spread all over a broad landscape, the management is more difficult and it's most costly. But if we look at what the management actors do, often we see that this is an example of the management guidelines of the region where this study was performed, but if we look to guidelines in other regions, we get similar patterns. So the first recommendation is monitoring. So if you detect an invasive species, okay, start monitoring. Then we will see. Only if we can detect an impact of the invasive species, so we can start a control or we can start to imaging a control. And only if we see a very important, a very huge impact, so we can imagine to start a costly and important eradication program. And this is clearly an approach that doesn't work, cannot work, because we detect the impact when the invasive species are abundant, where the invasive species are all over the landscape. And at this point, the management will not be effective, or will be effective only if we invest quite a lot of resources. So actually, as it's difficult to change the pipeline of policy indications, it's important to detect as soon as possible the impact of invasive species. If we can tell immediately which is going to be the impact, so we can perhaps have a quicker response by the managers. So we try to explore how we can quickly measure the impact of this invasive crayfish on amphibians and on dragonflies. Amphibians and dragonflies are two interesting taxa. On the one side, they have a complex life cycle. They have aquatic larvae, but the adults are not aquatic, and so the crayfish may have a different impact on the different life stages of those animals. Well, the study area was the same, but in this case, we expanded the number of wetlands, and the most important, we performed the monitoring in two different approaches. First, we used the standard approach. So we sampled the adults or the breeding attempts. So we see if amphibians try or dragonflies try to breed in a single wetland. And then we used the same approach I showed before to try to measure the breeding success. And we also tried to collect the exuvia of dragonflies that are a measure of the actual breeding success of dragonflies. So if we look at the distribution of adults, we got a negative relationship between the distribution of the crayfish and the distribution of amphibians for 3 species only. For one species, we detected an apparent positive relationship, so more green frogs in invaded wetlands. And for 3 more species, we did not detect any relationship. This is between abundance of distribution of crayfish and distribution of adult amphibians. So if we just look at the distribution of breeding attempts by amphibians, we can detect a negative impact on just 40% of species. It's not so much. And for dragonflies, it's even more surprising because apparently the dragonfly communities in invaded wetlands are even richer, slightly richer, by significantly richer than the communities in not invaded ponds. But if we change our perspective and we use the final stages of larvae as a measure of impact, so we try to measure the breeding success, we get the opposite relationship. 100% of amphibians show a clear negative relationship between abundance and crayfish invasion, and the same happens to dragonflies. So the richness of dragonfly communities for larvae, for exuvia, is quickly decreasing in the invading wetlands. And you just don't have any dragonfly if the abundance of crayfish is high. So, in summary, what we see is that for both amphibians and dragonflies, the adults continue breeding in invaded wetlands. So if we use the standard monitoring of adults to detect the impact of the crayfish on those species, we don't see nothing because the adults still breed in the invaded wetlands. But in the invaded wetlands, the breeding success is almost zero. So, well, of course, this is a case where we require immediate action to try to limit the spread of this crayfish. And what we believe is that approaches based on the monitoring of breeding success will provide a much faster assessment of the impact of invasive species. So finally, a final question is that, well, we have found that amphibians and dragonfly too still continue breeding in the invaded wetlands. This may be an ecological trap because we have frogs that breed in wetlands without crayfish and with crayfish, and they select for breeding wetlands where they actually have zero fitness. So, well, we have just started a few years ago, so studying, I know it's a very short time series, but we have 21 ponds where we have more or less a 50% presence of the crayfish, and the same ponds have been monitored for, at the moment, 4 years, and the crayfish was first detected in the area in 2009. So we can see what happens for a short time series. And so what we did is counting the abundance of 2 frog species, and the abundance was counted as the number of egg masses that corresponds to the number of females that breed in a given year. So for both species, what we see, this is the number of egg masses per each wetland. We see clearly that the number of egg masses, so the breeding attempts, is the same for invaded and not invaded ponds. So again, we don't have a difference in breeding effort between invaded and not invaded ponds, as we have seen before. But we have seen a clear and impressive decline in both the invaded and not, and in the not invaded ponds. And as impressive decline, I say 80% loss of egg masses in just 4 years. That's quite alarming. So how can we explain this strange pattern? Amphibian populations actually are normally present in the landscape in populations, in patchy population or network that are called the meta populations. So we have a number of individuals that stay most of the year in the woodland, and just for the breeding season they go for breeding in the wetlands, and apparently they are not able to identify the invaded wetlands as unsuitable. So they try to breed in wetlands where they actually will have zero fitness. And so ALF in this system of ponds actually provide zero fitness to the metapopulation system. And so what we see is that we have a recruitment only from the not invaded wetlands, but while for a number of wetlands where the crayfish is present, the breeding success is present. And so apparently what we may see is that the overall breeding in the remaining not invaded wetlands is not enough to maintain the whole metapopulation, because every year adults will try to go breeding in the invaded wetlands, so we will completely lose the reproductive effort of more or less half of the metapopulation system. Okay, so thank you very much. It's finished? Yes. And I want to say thank you to all the people that worked with me, particularly my co-authors, and Matteo Sies and Raul Manenti, and all the students that worked in the field. Thank you very much.